So when you drop your baby off for an 8-hour workday, what does that feel like for an infant?
They feel like you've died.
Outcomes 10, 20 years later in that child's life, much worse. More anxiety, more symptoms, more addictions, more broken relationships and broken marriages, more problems in their life, strongly correlated with that daycare piece.
The greatest fear for a child is the loss of a primary relationship.
And I do think that the excuse of like, well, that's what I can afford, or like I need to drop them off at this cheaper daycare where there's 14 kids when they're 8 months old. Maybe figure out something else. You don't want your kid having trauma forever. You do have options. You're just not willing to pursue those options.
If your kid is in school before 4 years old, they're not going to end up more intelligent?
No, not even close.
The studies show when a child has an attachment disorder at 12 months old, it literally follows them until they're 20 years old.
What we've done is we've created 2 generations, now to be 3 generations of children with attachment disorder. We're talking about an epidemic of mental illness in children and adolescents, which I think is rooted in the way we raise our children from a young age.
Do you feel guilty every time you drop your sweet little baby off at daycare as they're crying, calling for you to come back? You're trying to reassure yourself that this is fine and it's normal, except it's not normal and you should feel guilty. At least that's what some people are saying anyways. I feel like all of a sudden we went from being super supportive of working moms to shaming them for resorting to daycare. Strong claims are being made that daycare destroys children's attachment with their mother, that it permanently damages their development, and any benefits you thought you were getting from daycare are actual myths. And so if you don't want to screw up your child, you need to quit your job and stay home with them. And this isn't just from silly TikTokers either, it's from psychoanalysts and psychotherapists. With such wild claims, I wanted to investigate and see if there was any truth to this. Now let me tell you, this video put me through the ringer. It was really hard trying to find answers to these questions when there's so much conflicting information out there. But while my brain felt like it was about to explode trying to get to the bottom of this, luckily for you, you just get to sit back and enjoy everything I found as I tell it to you. So let's get into it. Is daycare ruining our children, and is all this mom shaming justified? So let's begin by addressing all the arguments that demonize daycare, starting with socialization.
A lot of stay-at-home moms who still put their kids in daycare 1 to 2 times a week because they think that it's benefiting them socially.
No. Just no. I can
Is it a lie?
I can debunk that myth.
A big reason people support daycare is because of the social benefits they're getting for their children.
How do we like daycare for socialization purposes? My son's development has soared though, honestly, after even just going for 2 days a week. He's learned to walk there. He is babbling more. He is playing more, starting to socialize more.
We live in a very independent society, which I've talked a lot about before, and putting your child in daycare gives them the opportunity to learn socialization when they may not interact with a lot of kids in their regular day-to-day. Well, as it turns out, the idea that babies need to socialize is a myth. In these early years, children don't actually play with other children. They do what's called parallel play. This is where they play beside other children, but not directly involved with them. Under the age of 2, children's main social development comes from interacting with you, the adult caregiver. Socialization starts with, you guessed it, the parents. Skin-to-skin contact, breastfeeding, talking, cuddling, singing, and reading are all ways parents can start interacting with newborns. All of those things you just kind of automatically do when you're loving your child sets the stage for relationships with others later. Strong, nurturing relationships with caregivers are really critical to healthy brain development. That's how they're learning. So starting children in daycare young doesn't actually help develop their social skills any more than spending time with their nuclear family does. But that also doesn't mean it hurts them socially, it's just neutral. Jan Fall, a specialist in child development, says that there's a notion among some parents that if they start their children interacting socially when younger than the age of 3, they'll ultimately end up being more skilled among friends. While no parent wants their toddler to be isolated from peers and playmates, hurrying up the process of playing cooperatively isn't really possible. Now, there is an exception exception, there's usually exceptions to things, where daycare can damage social development. This study on early childhood found that more hours of care were linked to poorer work habits and poorer social skills, though this was only the scenario when there was a high child-to-teacher ratio. Since under the age of roughly 2.5, children are learning their social skills mainly from adults. If there are fewer adults to keep the child's attention, then there's less opportunity for the children to learn these skills. And so the most important things babies need for their social development is a responsive caregiver. Serve and return interactions shape brain architecture. When an infant or young child babbles, gestures, or cries, and an adult responds appropriately with eye contact, words, or hug, neural connections are built and strengthened in the child's brain that support the development of communication and social skills. But, as you can probably guess, over the age of 2.5, 3, children can really benefit socially from daycare. Once they reach this age, they become less dependent on you, and their sense of identity becomes stronger and more secure. And that is when they graduate from parallel play to cooperative play. Julia Garduño, a speech therapist, says, "By 3, we start seeing turn-taking, cooperative play, and showing concern for a crying friend. These are the things they've been exposed to for years, and at this point they're confident enough to integrate those spoken and unspoken rules into their interactions." I feel like this is one of the more neutral points in the discussion of daycare because it doesn't seem like there's much harm to be had socially, no matter the age. As long as you're taking your child to a daycare where the teachers are giving your child what they need, aka the attention they need, then it's perfectly fine that daycare isn't necessarily improving their social skills like previously thought. This portion of today's video is sponsored by Brooklinen. In the craziness of motherhood, I like to have my bedroom feel like a little bit of an escape from everything, and my favorite way to do that is with a bedding set that's nice and bright, light, and peaceful. And that's why I love my Brooklinen bedding, because it does exactly that for me. Brooklinen is a premium brand of thoughtfully designed bedding for joy, built for comfort, and at the best quality and price. One of my favorite parts about Brooklinen is the variety and options you have to pick between. With that, you can mix and match over 20 colors and patterns. And that's what I did with my bedding. I went with a combination of 2 different styles to achieve the look I was going for. I have the washed linen core sheet in charcoal chambray and white stripe, paired with the linen quilt set in white diamond. I was looking for a bedspread that gave me that light, airy feeling of an all-white bedspread, but something that was a bit more practical. That's what I really love about this, is that all the parts of the bedding that are touching your body aren't the solid white parts, so it's a lot easier to maintain. And they don't just look great, they feel really great too. My first choice was to go with their linen line because their 100% linen has unique moisture wicking properties that actually keep you cooler than cotton. It looks effortless and casual because honestly I don't have the time to make my bedding look perfect anyways. Josh and I have been really loving this bedding over the past few months. During the spring when it was a bit colder, we loved using all of the bedding to keep us warm, and now that we're in the summer it's a bit warmer, we can just use the quilt and the sheet set and we're good to go. And what was most important to me is that this bedding felt as good as it looks. Right now Brooklinen is offering you 15% off your first order, so check the link in the description for that. Thank you so much to Brooklinen for sponsoring today's video, and now let's get back to daycare. Next up, we're going to talk about stress on children. We all know that chronic stress isn't good for our health, and some are claiming that children in daycare are experiencing elevated levels of stress, which will harm them in the long term.
Children in daycare show very intense signs of increased levels of cortisol, or the stress hormone, in their body, in their salivary. And so, we know that it causes stress to children. It's not good. Stress on the brain, particularly under a year old, is really not good for children.
If you didn't know, a normal cycle of cortisol in the body starts by rising in the morning and then slowly decreasing down as the day progresses. The concern is that some studies show children in daycare get that elevated cortisol in the morning, but then it stays elevated as the day goes on.
I don't give a what anyone says. Dropping your child off when they scream and cry every single day. Like, she just has never had a day where she's like, okay, I got this. I know, like, people are like, it gets better, or like, you'll get used to it. Nope. Nope. I feel awful.
This particular study says that we examined the increase in cortisol from mid-morning to mid-afternoon in 151 children in full-time home-based daycare. Compared to the cortisol levels at home, increases were noted in the majority of children, 63% at daycare, with 40% classified as a stress response. The rise in cortisol is said to be caused again by the teacher-to-child ratio being too high. While there are plenty of these studies showing the increase in cortisol from daycare, there are also studies showing that in specifically high-quality daycare, the child's stress response mimics that of a child not in daycare and with their primary care provider at home. This study shows this, saying a greater decline in cortisol was hypothesized and demonstrated for high-quality rather than unsatisfactory groups. As well, it's actually unclear what the long-term effects of stress from daycare are on children. Did that sentence make sense? Unclear what the long-term effects of stress from daycare are on children. That makes sense, right? It's unclear. One study I mentioned made the effort to point this out. It is important to note that it is not yet clear if these cortisol responses are at a sufficient level to increase the risk of negative outcomes for the children concerned. Research has not yet established what level of change in cortisol responsivity is necessary over what level of time for risk to be increased. Many studies, including this one, say that children may be at risk of long-term neurological problems, but I had a hard time finding studies that actually prove this. One study did find that children in childcare centers in the first 3 years of life have lower awakening cortisol levels at the age of 15. If you don't know what lower awakening cortisol levels means, like I didn't, it's associated with hypertension, depression, and autoimmune diseases. But this was for children in both childcare and having higher levels of maternal insensitivity. I think it's unfair to come to the conclusion that childcare is what's causing this when we know that the mother-baby relationship has the biggest impact on a child's outcome.
Anti-daycare or group childcare narrative is running rampant across social media right now. And let's clear some things up. First of all, in most of these videos, the children are happily playing and cry when they see their caregiver. They're not in distress. Haven't you ever been so happy to see someone you love that you get emotional when you see them? Kids are too, and they may cry upon reunion. That doesn't mean that they were being traumatized when they were apart.
To counter this further, there's this study that looked at the long-term effects of stress in daycare. Cortisol levels were measured 4 times during the day for the first, second, and 4th month after starting childcare. Many toddlers showed what was defined as a stress profile in the change in cortisol levels during the day in the first phase of the transition period. After 4 months, very few children showed this stress profile, probably because they adapted positively to the childcare setting.
Let me quickly tell you about my daycare experience. The first couple of weeks were hard, naturally. Harder on me than on him. He's now been in daycare for a year, and daycare was the most amazing thing I could have done for me and for him and for my partner and for our relationship. Daycare and the daycare educators become a part of your child's comfort. I feel so blessed that I will one day get to send my next baby to them.
Now, I don't think we should just dismiss the concerns with stress in daycare. It's obviously a very hard thing for your child to go through, separating themselves from mom and dad. But I just don't think there's enough evidence of the long-term effects of stress for us to just quit daycare altogether from this point alone. Okay, what I think is the most compelling argument against daycare so far is the concern with behavior.
Kids who spend time in daycare, they have more social issues, they have problems, externalizing problems, and they have more problems with adult-child conflict. Because what happens is these kids don't have that secure anchor on a regular basis. And so rather than learning how to deal with conflict and problem solving and how to socialize with a mature adult, they're learning from it from other kids.
I was just so sick of picking him up every single day and him like being distraught and like so all over the place and so unregulated, and every day the teacher would be like, he didn't listen today and he's doing this and he's doing that and like he's disrupting other kids. But it just got to the point where sending him was more work than keeping him at home.
One of the most quoted studies in this discussion comes out of Quebec and the effect that their daycare centers had on their children. In 1997, the Parti Québécois launched subsidized daycare, charging only $5 a day for government-funded spots. Now, with all this government funding available, the network of daycare providers increased substantially over the following years. But despite this boom in centers, the wait lists that parents faced were still very long, as there was an influx of parents who could actually afford daycare all of a sudden. The reason why this case in particular is so interesting is because until just a few years ago, Quebec was the only province or territory to have such affordable daycare. And so now we can see how having affordable and accessible childcare over the past 20 years affected those children in comparison to the rest of the country. And as it turned out, the findings were not very good. Within 10 years, comprehensive analysis of the universal $5 per day childcare program suggested cause for concern. Social development among children, as indicated by both emotional and behavioral measures, had significantly deteriorated in Quebec relative to the rest of Canada. To sum it up, this 2008 study on universal childcare says that relative to the changes in the rest of Canada, children in Quebec were far worse after the program in parent-reported aggression in particular. Now, this is very discouraging evidence for sure, but there's also been a lot of critique saying that this study doesn't tell the whole story. Many say that this increase in behavioral issues is not a good reflection of daycare overall, but is a reflection of specifically poor quality daycare. When the bill passed for $5 a day daycare, like I said, there was a huge demand for more centers, and so there was an influx of centers opening, but many of them were poor quality. Some say that they were just trying to take advantage of the system and the government funding. In 2005, 60% of the universal daycare program sites in Quebec were judged to be of minimal quality. Just 1/4 of the sites provided the care that met the standards necessary to qualify as good, very good, or excellent. And so this isn't a great argument saying that daycare definitely causes behavior issues, when of course when children aren't getting their needs met, they're gonna act out. And this is just a sneak peek into me trying to find the answer of if daycare causes behavior problems. For every study I found stating negative behavior outcomes, there was another study arguing there's no evidence for negative behavioral implications. While one study may say that for children before the age of 4 from middle-class and affluent families, 30 hours a week in daycare has about 2/3 the negative effects on the behavior of having a moderately depressed mother. Another study would say that there was no effect of the amount or type of childcare on disruptive behavior at 36 months. In fact, I even found one study that was trying to get to the bottom of this and assessing a conglomeration of studies from both sides on the matter. And even this one ended up saying, I don't know. I was driving myself crazy trying to find this answer, and at a certain point, I just accepted that this is beyond the limitations of my research ability. I'm not a research analyst who can dissect the legitimacy of the method and scope of the research and come to a conclusion of what's a reliable resource or not. I try my best to find accurate information, obviously based on peer reviews and consistencies in the field of topic, but if even the researchers can't agree on this, then it is beyond me. One of the things we know changes the outcome of children in daycare is the age that they attend and the time they spend there. Sending a 6-week-old baby to full-time daycare is very different from sending a 2-year-old to part-time daycare.
When you study education in school, they tell you that the 0 to 5 years are the most important part of the child's development. You learn and develop faster in those first 5 years than you will for the rest of your life. There have been studies about the quality of early childhood education and care, and then how that determines the way that someone lives the rest of their life. If they experience trauma or neglect in those first 5 years, it will impact everything that they do as an adult.
For instance, we see here that for 3 to 5-year-olds, full-time attendance at preschool led to no more significant gains than part-time attendance. But below that age is where we start to see potential damaging effects at higher hours of daycare. Reassessment just prior to school entry at age 4.5 indicated that more hours per week in childcare across the early years of life predicted lower social competence, higher externalizing problems, more adult-child conflict, and more negative peer play. And it's important to note that not all studies are set on 4.5 being when damage stops. I've read a lot of studies that say over the age of 2 is fine, but again, the vote is split. This study goes even further to say that some infants, particularly those who began daycare in the first year of life, who spend more than 10 hours a week in daycare and whose mothers provide less sensitive care, key point, had an increased risk in developing insecure infant-mother attachments. It's important to note again that the research world has not come to one definitive answer on this topic. While there's a trend showing that the younger the age and the higher the hours, the more potential of damage to your children, there isn't a unanimous answer on what age and what amount of time. Studies on the impact of quality of daycare for 0 to 3-year-olds were inconclusive. Some studies reported better intellectual development, improved independence, and improved concentration and sociability at school entry. Other studies reported lower rated learning abilities and an elevated risk of developing antisocial behavior in the future. With there being so much debate on the effects of a 2-year-old versus a 4-year-old, 15 hours versus 30 hours, I think for now it's fair to say use your own discretion as a parent based on how your own child is reacting to the hours they're in daycare. But one thing we know for certain has a positive correlation with children's outcome from daycare is the quality of daycare. I've mentioned this a few times in the video so far, but higher quality daycare counters a lot of the negative effects associated with it.
The quality of care that you get in the first 5 years can determine your social emotional relationships for the rest of your life. They'll determine what job you're more likely to get, what level of education you're more likely to get, whether or not you're more likely to go to jail, whether or not you're more likely to have an unhealthy relationship with food. All of these things are determined usually in the first 5 years of your life.
This paper on early childhood education says attendance at childcare in the first 3 years of life has no strong effects on cognitive and language development for children who are not disadvantaged at home, provided childcare is of high quality. Quality is key. Poor quality childcare was found to produce deficits in language and cognitive function for young children. So what makes for high quality daycare? Well, for one, it's not about the cost of daycare, it's about the workers and how they respond to the children. The care providers should genuinely like children, be compassionate towards them, understand differences, respond to the children when they need help, and provide stimulating activities designed for the children's age and development levels. Within that, it's really important to look at that teacher to child ratio. Especially in those early years, 0 to 1, babies need a care provider that has the capacity to respond to distress, but also the ability to create a strong bond with the child. Children's early years require a lot of guidance, supervision, instruction, and individual attention. By keeping low ratios, teachers can adequately monitor the health and safety of the class. They can also form better relationships with each child, allowing them to create more meaningful connections, which will lead to better understanding of where each child is developmentally. Everything I've read about the damages daycare can have on babies says that it comes from babies who are not properly cared for or from a daycare with a high rotation of staff. With a good teacher to child ratio, ideally 1 to 3, but more commonly 1 to 4, teachers are able to respond to the babies when needed. And as you can expect, as the children get older, that child to teacher ratio can increase with no harmful effects because the children are growing their independence. And like I said, it's important that the childcare center you go to has a low turnover of staff. This way, you know that the teacher that your child has bonded with will most likely have that teacher for the time that they're at that school.
For all the parents out there with their kids about to start daycare, I feel you. It is really hard and a big transition, not only for them, but also for the parents. This is my second child that's about to start daycare, and it definitely has not got easier from the first time around. I definitely feel a certain way. I'm very nervous. I have full faith and confidence in the center. The center is actually amazing. I couldn't dream of a better center. The facility that they have is great. The educators that they have there are just amazing, and I just know they're going to take the best care of my kids. So that definitely fills me with a lot of comfort.
The only problem with this scenario is that apparently high quality childcare centers is not the norm in the US. Most daycare centers are poor to average quality, and therefore the children can't reap any positive benefits from it. Only 10 to 15% of daycare in the US is high quality, and many childcare centers offer disturbingly low quality programs. This is a huge hangup because if high quality centers were available everywhere people need them, then of course we wouldn't have an issue. But if you live in a town that has only low quality daycare centers, then you're forced to make a tough decision. So with that being said, I think it's most important that you take the time to research the care facility you're looking into to ensure that your child is being properly cared for. In this conversation, we most importantly need to discuss what we can actually do to set our children and ourselves up for success. In a world that forces women to work with the requirement of dual income homes in a lot of cities, the solution to this inconclusive problem of daycare isn't as cut and dry as just stay at home and be with your kids. If this information I've given you, or if looking into the daycare options in your area makes you uncomfortable, I want to offer some suggestions just based on what I've seen other people do. A lot of these options might not work for you, but I still think it's important to have this discussion because maybe it'll spark an idea that you haven't thought about before, give you a different perspective, think outside of the box. First of all, I do want to say I don't think it's feasible for women to just take 5 years off their career whenever they have a kid. I know that's often what's suggested, just stay home until the kids are school age. And I have said this before, but being out of your field of work for that long can have damaging effects on your career. Depending where you work, a lot of things can change in 5 years, and when you go to re-enter the field after the 5 years, at best you could be behind on the times, or at worst you can't get rehired because you don't have the experience anymore. As well, many people have multiple children, so it's not just 5 years off, but it's 10 years, 15 years off your career, which sounds like a career death sentence to me. You still have to figure out ways to manage work and children, so let's talk options.
So the next part of the video was me sharing all the ideas I had of how you can work and not use traditional daycare, and I'm now realizing that it's probably more helpful and more interesting to hear from actual moms doing this and sharing their experiences of getting a little bit creative or just using the resources they have around them. So I made a compilation of videos of moms saying just that. Here you go.
Business owner mummies, or mummies that need to work part-time but not full-time, and you're looking for childcare within your area, is there not something we can do where we meet other parents that also need part-time childcare? I want like 2, maybe 3 days off per week where I'm not actively looking after my children all day long and I get to go out and work. And then the other days of the week where I'm with my children, I might as well be with other people's children as well. So it's kind of a win-win situation. Like, can we like organize like child swaps or something?
I just wanted to share some of the things that people are doing to combat the childcare crisis. It seems like this is like a really common issue. But anyways, I've seen a lot of people post that they do like shift work or like switch off with their husband. That is great if you're able to do that. I know like a lot of people can't do that, but if you can, I think that's like a really, really great option.
I'm gonna tell you the biggest life hack for childcare. What you can do is the two families can work together to share one nanny. So for example, you pay that nanny $25 an hour between 2 kids. Now it's $12.50 an hour. You save, your child is going to be so much happier, not in a daycare setting, and you have flexibility in your life.
How homeschool gets done on the days that I have to work. I'm a homeschool mom of 2, and 2 days a week I do work out of the house. The 2 girls were still sleeping, and I came up here because our homeschool room is up here so that I could prep for the day. It was a really beautiful Monday morning. On Mondays, my mom does homeschool with the kids, and on Wednesdays, my mother-in-law does. So I start by writing out each child's tasks. I started with my 7-year-old. I write down exactly what needs to be done to try and make it as easy as possible for my mom. And by this point, my mom was here, and she was downstairs waiting for me.
This is a recommendation for parents of toddlers who work from home and find themselves working without childcare some days. Everyone made fun of me for doing this in my family, but I don't freaking care because it's one of the best things I did. I bought my son one of these Bluetooth used keyboards off of Amazon. We didn't have any old ones of our own, so I bought one. He loves this thing. And whenever it's time to work and I'm with him, but I also need to get work done, I set this down. He sits next to me and I'm like, okay, it's time to go to the office. Tip, tap, type away. And he just sits there banging on his keyboard being like, mommy's in the office. We're all working. The best thing ever. Keeps him occupied for like a good chunk of time. And then we're in the office together.
I do also want to take a second to emphasize the importance of women having the right to their careers. I talked about this briefly in my Tradwife video, but this whole push for women to return to traditional values, stay at home with the kids, bake bread, wearing aprons every day, it makes me worried. Despite the risk of putting all your financial security in your husband's hands, my heart also just breaks for these women who are sometimes just living in their husband's shadow. Whether that's staying home with the kids to support his career or being being an employee of his business, whatever it is. I just feel like, what about your dreams? What do you want to do? If you had the opportunity to not care for children and not support a man, what would you do? And that's coming from someone who loves supporting my husband. I love caring for my children, but I also love having my own dreams. I just see so many women online giving up their passions and their drive to stay home with their kids, which is beautiful. I don't want to discount that, but I also see them losing parts of themselves in doing so. And no, I'm not talking in absolutes. There's obviously women who just love being stay-at-home moms, love that their whole purpose is raising children. It is a very admirable job. My worry comes from this trend of being a stay-at-home trad wife, and that some women are going to make the decision to give up too much of themselves because it's trending online and then become disappointed in their lives later. One thing I want to talk about the most is how insane it is that we even have to discuss whether babies under the age of 1 should be going to daycare or not. As a Canadian, I'm very disconnected from this world as we have the option of 12 to 18 months maternity leave. And I've always known that the US doesn't have federal maternity leave, but it wasn't until I became a mother myself that I actually got to experience what was being lost. I say this out of a place of love with absolutely no judgment to any woman who has put their infant in childcare, but it is inhumane to force women to choose between caring for their babies or choosing to be financially secure. Seeing videos on TikTok of mothers dropping off their infants at daycare because the only other option is to give up their career is one of the saddest things I've seen, and I mean that genuinely. I'm sick of seeing that all these people talking about the problem of daycare are shoving the guilt onto the mother that you need to be a stay-at-home mom, otherwise you're a bad mom. This is not the solution. The solution comes from the government taking care of the women and children of your country. Now, I have no idea how to make that happen. I am not a US citizen. I have no role to play in this. And I also know that a lot of people have been fighting for this for a long time with no prevail. But we need to take the hate and the guilt off of the mom and put it on the government, who apparently hates the women who are raising the next generation of citizens. It is not the mom's fault for using daycare because you give her no other option. And no, it's not good enough that you have privatized maternity leave. Every mother deserves the right to be with her baby for at least the first year of their life. Okay, now that I've gotten off my podium, what do they say? Off my, oh my gosh, what's that called? Milk crate? Oh my gosh, what's it called? What do you stand on? Soapbox. Soapbox. That's embarrassing. Anyways, I hope you're not disappointed in this video that I didn't give you definitive answers one way or the other, because honestly, I wouldn't blame you if you're a little disappointed. I was too. I wanted answers. I would love to hear daycare is fine, keep doing what you're doing, or even daycare's not fine, let's fix it, or I don't know. But my hope at least is that I've given you some insight on the matter and some awareness to the risks that are involved with daycare. I also feel the need to re-emphasize that I am not a research analyst or specialist. I am just a girl with a dream of finding some truth. And so take everything I've said with a grain of salt and do what you think is best for your family. I do also want to note that there is more to this conversation, like attachment theory and the effects of social economic status, and I go into those in my bonus Patreon video this month. To end this off, the effects of daycare are not cut and dry, and while I can't be the one to say whether it's good or bad, I can say that we all need to be doing more to support mothers. We need more conversations with actual solutions instead of crucifying mothers for doing the best they can for their babies. Thank you again to Brooklinen for sponsoring a portion of today's video. Make sure you go to the link in the description if you want 15% off your first order.